The virus began with a rejection letter. What if the most dangerous virus in human history wasn't biological? What if it didn't infect lungs or blood, but beliefs? What if it didn't spread through sneezes, but through speeches? In 1907, a young man stood trembling in front of an art academy in Vienna. He clutched his portfolio, sketches of old buildings, a few lifeless landscapes. The examiners flipped through them and said 5 simple words: not talented enough, rejected. That rejection, like a microscopic wound, became the entry point for something far more contagious than influenza. Because that man's name was Adolf Hitler, and the world had just made the most dangerous paper cut in history. This isn't just history, it's biology. Because what spread after that was nothing short of viral. An idea, a delusion, an ideology so infectious that it consumed an entire nation's immune system. And once inside, it mutated into laws, into violence, into genocide. By the end, 50 million people were dead. Not from a germ, but from a man whose mind had become the perfect host. And here's the part nobody wants to admit. The symptoms are back. You're going to see them clearly in the next few minutes. You'll learn how democracies don't die in explosions, but in silence. How genocide doesn't begin with murder, but with meetings. How evil doesn't arrive dressed as a monster, but in a suit and tie, smiling. You'll see the 7 symptoms of authoritarianism, the playbook, the lies that feel like truth, the compromises that open the door, and the shocking reason why the people who made it possible looked a lot like you. Because viruses don't care if you're smart. They don't care if you're educated. They only care if you're tired, confused, and afraid. And if you think this story is about Germany in the 1930s, you're already infected. My name is Insert Narrator, and this is Dark Lessons, the Virus of Power. What you learn here won't just change how you see Hitler. It may just change how you vote, how you speak, how you resist. Because every authoritarian outbreak in history starts the same way, with people who never thought it could happen to them. Conditions of collapse, when the body was wounded. Democracy doesn't die with a bang. It starts with a bruise you don't notice. The Weimar Republic looked like a state on paper. It had a constitution. It had elections. It had freedom of the press. But underneath, it was hemorrhaging. After the trauma of World War I, Germany was a nation bleeding from every artery, economically, politically, psychologically. And no one had the tools or the will to cauterize the wounds. Here's what you need to understand. Authoritarianism doesn't need evil men. It needs a sick host. Like a virus entering a weakened body, Hitler arrived precisely when Germany was too injured to fight back. Economically, the numbers were apocalyptic. After the Treaty of Versailles demanded 132 billion gold marks in reparations, equivalent to over $400 billion today, Germany's currency imploded. In 1923, hyperinflation reduced the German mark to toilet paper. Families needed wheelbarrows of cash for bread. Middle-class savings vanished in days. Parents watched their life's work turn to ash, not from war, but from their own government's surrender and failure. Politically, the infection spread faster. The Reichstag changed governments 20 times in 14 years. No party could hold power for long. Coalition collapsed into coalition. Paramilitary thugs battled in the streets as citizens lost faith in debate and ballots. Why vote, they said, if nothing ever changes? And the psychological wounds? That's where the virus thrived most deeply. Veterans returned from the trenches shattered. Today we call it PTSD. Back then they called it cowardice. Men who had survived gas attacks and bayonet charges now sat jobless, broken, humiliated. The war didn't end, it followed them home. That's the dangerous part, when humiliation becomes identity. In a country where dignity is lost, desperation becomes doctrine. People will trade freedom for food. They'll sacrifice tolerance for safety. They'll listen to anyone who says, "I can fix this," especially if that voice gives them someone to blame. Sound familiar? Because here's what the latest research says. In 2025, the world's economic inequality is now at its highest level since 1929. According to Oxfam, the richest 1% own more wealth than 99% combined. Meanwhile, faith in democracy is collapsing. The Edelman Trust Barometer reports that trust in governments has fallen below 35% in much of the developed world. And young people, they're abandoning democracy altogether. A recent Cambridge study found over 45% of millennials in Western democracies no longer believe democracy is essential. Desperation, distrust, disconnection, that's all the virus needs. Have you ever noticed how often fear turns into fury? How easily we're hurting becomes they're to blame? How fast your social feed turns sadness into suspicion, then into rage? That's not just political dysfunction. That's a body, your nation, showing symptoms. But this is just the first stage of infection. Because if the immune system doesn't act soon, the virus finds a host. And in Germany, that host was a failed painter who had learned exactly how to infect the mind. The first host, the artist who inhaled hate. It didn't start with a dictator. It started with a dreamer, rejected, invisible, and quietly boiling. In the winter of 1907, a teenager arrived in Vienna with a portfolio under his arm and grand ambitions in his chest. He believed he was destined for greatness, that art would be his path. But the examiners at the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts disagreed. Twice they looked at his work, rigid buildings, soulless landscapes, and twice they sent him away. That teenager, Adolf Hitler, didn't just walk out with rejection. He walked out infected with resentment, with shame, and eventually with rage. For 5 years, Hitler drifted. He sold painted postcards to tourists, slept in men's hostels, ate from charity lines. Day after day, Vienna showed him a mirror. No status, no friends, no future. But it also handed him something darker, a scapegoat. The mayor of Vienna at the time, Karl Lueger, was a master of populism. He gave fiery speeches blaming Jews for economic decline, political failure, and moral decay. And the crowds loved him. Young Hitler listened, watched, studied. He didn't just inhale the hatred, he began to breathe it. This is how the virus works. It finds the isolated, the ignored, the humiliated. It whispers to them, it's not your fault, it's theirs. And it offers a twisted kind of relief, a reason, a story, a villain. Modern psychology now recognizes this pattern. Personal failure breeds external blame. When identity is shattered, the mind seeks enemies. Combine that with poverty, isolation, and propaganda, and you get radicalization. And it's still happening. Not in Vienna hostels, but in online forums, basement apartments, algorithm-fed social bubbles, where angry young men, rejected and resentful, are seduced by movements that promise power and identity through hate. But Hitler's transformation didn't end in Vienna. It accelerated on the battlefield. When World War I broke out, Hitler found what he had always craved: belonging. He wasn't a nobody anymore. He was a soldier, a brother, a patriot. He fought bravely, was wounded twice, and awarded the Iron Cross. For the first time, he mattered. Then it all collapsed. November 1918, Hitler lay in a military hospital, temporarily blinded by gas. He heard the news. Germany had surrendered. The war was lost. It broke him. He called it the greatest disgrace in history. And in that moment, something shifted. The virus had found a perfect carrier. He would not paint. He would not create. He would destroy. In 1919, the German army assigned Hitler to spy on a fringe group, the German Workers' Party. At a small beer hall meeting, someone suggested Bavaria should secede from Germany. Hitler stood up, uninvited, and spoke. He raged. He inspired. He commanded attention. Afterward, the founder whispered, "We could use a man like that." That speech was the first recorded outbreak. He wasn't just infected now, he was contagious. Have you ever noticed how easily people follow certainty, even if it's dangerous? How charisma often trumps truth? How the loudest voice in the room becomes the leader, not the wisest? It's not a coincidence. It's not random. It's psychological biology. And Hitler was now mutating. But even then, he wasn't yet unstoppable. In 1923, he failed. Badly. A coup attempt collapsed. He was arrested. Most men would have disappeared. But the virus adapted. Because what Hitler did next would become the most diabolical strategy of modern history: to destroy democracy using democracy's own tools. The Superspreader. How propaganda became airborne. It only took 40 people in a beer hall to start an outbreak. September 1919. A small political meeting, bad lighting, cheap beer, few listeners. But one angry man in uniform stood up and turned fury into performance. Adolf Hitler didn't just talk, he infected. His words sliced through the room like a viral spike, binding to every insecurity, every national wound. That night, he wasn't just speaking. He was mutating into something far more dangerous, a transmitter. This is how the virus of power goes airborne, through propaganda. After the failed beer hall putsch in 1923, most revolutionaries would have vanished in shame. Hitler didn't. He turned his trial into a spectacle. The courtroom became a stage. Reporters scribbled quotes. His supporters cheered. And when he went to prison, he didn't sulk. He wrote a manifesto, Mein Kampf, a viral genome disguised as autobiography. Inside, he laid out the formula: identify the scapegoat, simplify the problem, repeat the lie, package it with pride. When Hitler left prison, he didn't return with bullets. He returned with a blueprint. He pivoted. No more coups. He'd play the game of democracy, then poison it from the inside. He told different stories to different crowds. In the countryside, he promised jobs. In the cities, he promised order. In churches, he promised morality. To industrialists, he promised profit. Every promise wrapped around a common core: fear plus identity plus blame. He created a propaganda machine unlike anything seen before. Joseph Goebbels, a failed novelist turned fanatic, became his chief of narrative. Posters, speeches, radio, rallies. It wasn't about logic, it was about feeling, about turning emotion into obedience. And it worked spectacularly. In 1928, the Nazi Party barely scraped 2.6% of the vote. By 1930, 18%. By July 1932, 37.3%. They became the largest party in Germany. But here's what most people don't know. Hitler never won a majority. He didn't need to, because by then, he was already inside the system. And systems, they crave stability, not justice. So conservative elites, people who should have known better, made a deal. Let's make him chancellor, they said. We'll control him. He's loud but useful. The virus had just been invited into the bloodstream. Sound familiar? Today, the same techniques echo across our world, but evolved. You see them on TikTok, short, emotional bursts of blame. You see them in deep fakes, a politician's mouth moving, but the words never spoken. You see them in YouTube rabbit holes. 15 videos deep, you're not informed, you're converted. And the algorithm doesn't care. It feeds what gets clicks, and rage gets clicks. Have you ever felt yourself pulled into a belief? Not because it made sense, but because it felt right. Have you ever shared something you weren't sure was true, just because it matched how you felt? That's not weakness, that's design. Propaganda isn't about truth, it's about infection. And Hitler understood this before the world did. But propaganda was only the aerosol. The real sickness, the final mutation, came when evil looked ordinary, when murder was planned in meetings, when genocide came with good penmanship. The boardroom of genocide, bureaucracy became death. January 20th, 1942, a snowy Berlin morning. 15 men arrived at a beautiful villa by the lake, known as the Wannsee House. They were not soldiers. They were lawyers, administrators, economists, men with PhDs. They took their seats, poured their coffee, and began the meeting. The agenda, the final solution to the Jewish question. They spoke for 90 minutes. No one raised their voice, no one stormed out. There were no fists slammed on tables. Just calm discussion, like supply chain managers deciding on routes and packaging. Words like evacuation, resettlement, special treatment floated through the room like polite abstractions. But what they were really planning was the murder of 11 million people. This is how the virus of power evolves. It doesn't always scream. It doesn't need monsters. It just needs men in suits who don't ask questions. The Wannsee Conference minutes survive. 16 pages of bureaucratic horror. Not once does the word murder appear. Evacuation to the east meant gas chambers. Processing meant execution. Special treatment meant death. One of the men present, Adolf Eichmann, later testified, "We didn't think of ourselves as killers. We were just following orders. It was administrative." But this was no accident. It was deliberate obfuscation, making mass murder look like logistics. It's what philosopher Hannah Arendt later called the banality of evil. And it worked because the system, like the human body, stopped resisting. Do you know who was in that room? Dr. Roland Freisler, State Secretary of Justice. Dr. Wilhelm Stuckart, co-author of the Nuremberg Laws. Dr. Joseph Buehler, lawyer. Dr. Georg Leibrandt, historian. These weren't maniacs. They were educated professionals, and they engineered one of the greatest atrocities in history without ever firing a bullet. This is the most terrifying part of the virus. It convinces good people they're just doing their jobs. And don't think this is ancient history. In 2024, the Myanmar military used Excel spreadsheets to allocate resources for ethnic cleansing against the Rohingya. In China, Uyghur education programs are managed with facial recognition databases, software-generated risk scores, and quiet paperwork. Evil doesn't need to yell, it just needs to be normalized. The mutation. Today's power isn't wearing a swastika. What if the virus has evolved and now it's digital? In the 1930s, it took months to distribute propaganda. Today, it takes milliseconds. Back then, it took secret police to monitor speech. Now your own phone does it for you, voluntarily. The virus of power has mutated, and it's smarter. You've probably heard this before. History repeats itself. But that's not true. History mutates. It adapts to its host. Authoritarianism doesn't return wearing jackboots and shouting in German. It shows up wrapped in patriotism, national security, economic reform. It tweets, it live streams, it smiles. And yet, it always uses the same playbook. Sign 1, scapegoating. Blame one group for everything. Sign 2, dehumanization. Use metaphors to erase empathy. When someone becomes less than human, anything can be justified. Sign 3, cult of personality. The leader becomes a savior. Questioning him isn't just disagreement, it's betrayal. Sign 4, rejection of expertise. If truth is subjective, the virus spreads without resistance. Sign 5, control of information. Now leaders sue journalists, ban platforms, or drown truth in algorithmic sludge. Sign 6, emergency powers. Everywhere from India to Turkey, crises are used to suspend rights. The virus loves chaos because chaos justifies control. Sign 7, normalization of violence. When violence becomes patriotic, infection is terminal. But here's what makes 2025 more dangerous than 1933. Technology. Social media doesn't just spread lies, it locks them in. The algorithm learns what outrages you and feeds it. Deepfakes now mimic politicians' voices, faces, words. Surveillance software tracks your protests. The virus doesn't need speeches anymore. It just needs your scroll. The immune response resistance as antibodies. Every virus, no matter how lethal, eventually meets resistance. But humanity's antibodies don't always wear fluttering capes. In the case of authoritarianism, the antibodies aren't found in test tubes or hospitals. They're found in people, ordinary people who decide, even at the cost of everything, to say one word, no. Witold Pilecki was a Polish army officer. In 1940, he did something no one had ever done. He volunteered to be arrested. Why? So he could infiltrate Auschwitz. Sophie Scholl was just 21, a university student. No weapon, no army, just a leaflet. She and her brother Hans distributed anti-Nazi flyers at their campus. These people didn't start as heroes. They became them. In the moment, just like antibodies, they responded to the threat, not with fear, but with truth, with protection, with sacrifice. And today we are seeing modern antibodies form again. In Belarus, Maria Kolesnikova tore up her passport at the border so they couldn't deport her. She chose prison over silence. The virus always mutates, but so does courage. Have you ever wondered what you'd do in a time like this? Would you be silent? Would you stay safe? Or would you speak? You are the immune system now, and resistance is no longer optional, it's survival. Never again is a choice. The final mutation is you. It doesn't start with gas chambers. It starts with silence. Democracy doesn't collapse in a single thunderous crash. It rots quietly. And if the virus of power has one final, most terrifying mutation, it's this. It needs you to do nothing. You who scroll past the headline because it's too depressing. You who whisper your opinion instead of speaking it aloud. You who know something is wrong, but tell yourself someone else will fix it. This is how it always happens. In Germany, Hitler never won a majority. He was appointed by people who thought they could control him. The Holocaust didn't happen because millions of Germans were evil. It happened because millions of Germans went along, looked away, believed the lies, justified the small steps until they led to an abyss. It's happening again, not in the same uniforms, not with the same slogans, but the pattern is identical. The virus doesn't need to repeat. It only needs to rhyme. So here's what history demands of you now. Look in the mirror. Ask yourself, when was the last time I said no to power? When was the last time I stood up, even if I stood alone? When was the last time I chose truth, knowing it would cost me? You don't need to be famous. You don't need a platform. You don't even need to be fearless. You only need to say, I see what's happening, and I will not be part of it. Never again is not a promise made by history. It is a decision made by you, every day. The virus of power only survives in silence. So what will you say next? You are the immune system now. You've just walked through the anatomy of a plague, not of the body, but of the soul. You've seen how democracy bleeds, how power infects, how ordinary people either become hosts or healers. If this video shook you, don't look away. That discomfort is a signal, a response, an awakening. So here's what you can do. Vote like democracy depends on it, because it does. Speak when it's easier to stay silent, because silence is permission. Think critically, because propaganda only works on autopilot. Protect the vulnerable, because history judges us by who we stood with, not what we said. Share this message because knowledge is immunity, and we are overdue for a global vaccine. Remember this, it didn't start with death camps. It started with words, with scapegoats, with legal paperwork, with looking away. And it only stops when people like you start looking closer. You are the immune system now, and history is watching.